There is a mechanism inside your brain that is quietly deciding right now whether your life is worth the effort. Not your mood, not your willpower, not your discipline. A circuit, a biological architecture. And after 40, it starts to break in a very specific way that almost nobody is talking about. Here is what makes this dangerous. The breakdown does not feel like a breakdown. It feels like you. It feels like getting older. It feels like the natural slowing down that everyone said was coming. But it is not natural, and it is not irreversible. What is actually happening inside your control center after 40 is a measurable, documented shift in the way your brain assigns value to everything. Your food choices, your energy, your sleep, your relationships, your drive to protect your own health. When this circuit degrades, nothing feels worth the effort. And when nothing feels worth the effort, the engine stops being maintained. This video is not about motivation. It is not about habits or hacks. This is a systems-level diagnosis of what happens to the reward architecture inside your brain after 40, and what a real recalibration looks like for an engine that was never broken, just running on the wrong protocol. Stay with me. What comes next changes how you read every signal your body has been sending you. Block 2, the control center. What dopamine actually is and why your brain stopped listening. Let's start by dismantling the most expensive misconception about dopamine. You were told it is the pleasure chemical, the feel-good molecule, the reward your brain delivers after something good happens. That is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It is about value assignment. It is the signal your control center sends when it decides something is worth pursuing, worth protecting, worth the energy expenditure. Dopamine does not fire after the reward. It fires in anticipation of a reward that the brain has calculated is worth the effort. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video. Because if dopamine were just about pleasure, the fix would be simple. Feel more pleasure. Problem solved. But dopamine is about drive, the internal signal that says, this is worth it. And when that signal degrades, every single behavior that protects your health becomes harder. Not because you are weaker, because the engine stopped receiving the signal that the maintenance is worth running. Think about how your control center works. It runs a constant background calculation. It scans your environment, your internal state, your history, and it assigns anticipated value to every possible action. Eat the salad or order the pizza. Go to bed or scroll for another hour. Walk outside or stay on the couch. When dopamine signaling is robust, that calculation has real weight. The brain can feel the future value of the good choice and assign it enough signal to compete with the easier, faster option. When dopamine signaling degrades, the future value disappears. Only the present signal matters. And the present signal of the salad, the walk, the early night is almost always weaker than the processed alternative engineered specifically to hijack the circuit. This is the root of what most people after 40 experience as a loss of motivation, a loss of discipline, a loss of the person they used to be. It is not a personality change. It is a systems failure in the value assignment architecture of the control center. Now, here is where the timeline becomes critical. Dopamine receptor density, the actual number of active receptor sites in your brain capable of receiving the dopamine signal, begins measurable decline in the mid-30s. By the mid-40s, neuroimaging studies show that this decline is no longer subtle. The signal is genuinely weaker. The circuit is genuinely less sensitive. Research tracking dopamine system function across age groups found something particularly significant. The decline in receptor density after 40 is not linear. It accelerates. And the acceleration is heavily influenced by behavioral inputs, meaning the way you live either slows the decline or dramatically speeds it up. This is not a passive process happening to you. It is an interactive one. The engine is responding to its operating conditions. And for most people over 40 in the modern world, those operating conditions are pushing the decline faster than biology alone ever would. Here is what that looks like in the body. You finish a meal and feel nothing. You complete something you worked hard on and reach immediately for your phone. You wake up on a day with no obligations and feel a vague, undefined restlessness. Not sadness, not anxiety, just flatness. That flatness is not emptiness. That is a control center that has lost its ability to assign adequate value to real-life experiences. And the response that most people have to that flatness, reaching for higher stimulation, faster inputs, stronger signals, is precisely what deepens the damage. In the next part, we look at exactly how modern life engineered that trap, and why after 40, the walls of that trap close faster than most people realize, until they are already inside. Block 3. The hijack. How the modern world broke your reward circuit, and why 40 is the turning point. Let's be honest about something. The dopamine system did not degrade on its own. It was pushed, systematically, deliberately, by an environment engineered to extract as much signal from your reward circuit as possible, for as long as possible, without any concern for what that extraction costs the system over time. Understanding this is not about blame. It is about diagnosis. You cannot fix a system failure without understanding the source of the failure. So let's trace it. Your dopamine architecture evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. It was built for a specific kind of world, one where rewards were rare, unpredictable, and required real effort to obtain. Food was not guaranteed. Safety required vigilance. Connection required proximity and vulnerability. In that world, the dopamine system worked with extraordinary precision. Scarcity made every signal count. Effort made every reward feel real. The circuit was calibrated to a low-stimulation environment, and within that environment, it was exquisitely sensitive. Then that world was replaced almost overnight. Consider what your control center processes in a single ordinary day. Before your feet touch the floor in the morning, you have already delivered hundreds of micro-stimulations to the reward circuit through your phone. Notifications, reactions, scroll-triggered novelty hits. Each one a small dopamine spike, each one followed by a small crash, before breakfast. Then food engineered in laboratories, not to nourish the fuel system, but to hit the reward circuit harder than anything that exists in nature. Combinations of salt, fat, and sugar calibrated with precision to produce a dopamine response that real food cannot match. Then work stress, then more screen exposure. Then the evening alcohol to decompress, which initially spikes dopamine and then over time systematically suppresses dopamine baseline production. Then fragmented sleep that prevents the overnight repair cycle from completing, which means the circuit starts the next day already compromised. And then it all repeats. Every single one of these inputs touches the reward circuit. Every spike artificially above baseline triggers a compensatory downregulation. The brain reduces receptor sensitivity in response to the excess signal. The baseline drops. The next day requires slightly more stimulation to feel the same effect. This is the mechanism researchers describe as dopaminergic blunting. And the clinical picture of it in adults over 40 is consistent and alarming. Nothing feels worth it anymore. Not the salad, not the walk, not the real conversation, not the investment in sleep. The engine looks at these low-stimulation, high-value activities and returns the same signal every time. Not enough. Not worth the fuel. Now, here is why 40 is the turning point. Before 40, the system has enough reserve capacity to absorb this kind of chronic overstimulation. The decline is happening, but slowly enough that most people feel only vague symptoms. A little less energy, a little more difficulty with motivation, a little more reliance on caffeine and sugar to function. After 40, the reserve capacity is gone. The biological decline in receptor density begins to interact with the behavioral degradation caused by years of overstimulation. And two compounding variables accelerate the failure in ways that are almost never discussed together. The first is hormonal firmware. Estrogen and dopamine have a direct neurochemical relationship. Estrogen actively supports dopamine receptor sensitivity in the brain. As estrogen declines through perimenopause, dopamine sensitivity drops with it. This is not a coincidence. This is a documented physiological link, and it explains why so many women entering their mid-40s report a sudden, sharp loss of motivation, drive, and the ability to feel satisfaction from things that used to work. The same mechanism exists for men. Testosterone supports dopamine pathway regulation. As androgen levels decline through the 40s and 50s, the reward circuit loses a critical regulatory support. The firmware that was modulating the hardware begins to run outdated. The second variable is sleep architecture. After 40, the proportion of deep, slow-wave sleep decreases naturally. And deep sleep is when the brain runs a process called glymphatic clearance, a biological maintenance cycle that flushes metabolic debris from neural tissue, including byproducts that accumulate in the dopamine pathways. When that clearance is incomplete night after night, the debris builds. The signal degrades. The control center starts running on contaminated circuits. You are not just tired the next day. You are operating a reward system that never completed its maintenance cycle. This is the compounding picture of the hijack after 40. It is not one problem. It is behavioral overstimulation, hormonal firmware degradation, and incomplete overnight repair, all running simultaneously, each one amplifying the damage from the others. In the next part, we follow the damage downstream, because what a broken reward circuit does to the rest of the engine is far more dangerous than most people understand, and it shows up in places most doctors are not looking. Here is the part most people never connect. When the dopamine system breaks down, they look for the damage in their mood, in their motivation, in their mental health. They rarely look at their waistline, their cardiovascular markers, their muscle mass, their inflammatory load. But the damage does not stay in the brain. It never did. The control center governs the entire engine. When the control center loses signal, every downstream system begins to drift. And after years of drift, the symptoms look like aging, but the mechanism is something else entirely. Let's trace the failure path. The first system to show damage is the fuel system, the metabolism. This surprises most people, but the connection is direct and well documented. Dopamine receptors exist not only in the brain, but in the pancreas, the gut lining, and adipose tissue. The reward circuit plays an active role in regulating insulin sensitivity, the fuel system's ability to process glucose cleanly and efficiently. When dopamine signaling weakens, insulin regulation becomes less precise. The fuel lines lose calibration. Blood sugar swings become more pronounced. The body begins storing more fuel as fat, particularly visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat wrapped around the organs, rather than burning it. And simultaneously, the blunted reward circuit intensifies cravings for fast energy foods, sugar, refined carbohydrates, ultra-processed inputs that deliver a quick dopamine signal through the fastest available route. The engine is not craving those foods because you lack discipline. It is craving them because it is trying to compensate for a weakened reward signal by finding the shortest path to stimulation. The fuel system degrades. The engine gets heavier. The metabolic load increases. And most people spend years fighting this at the level of diet, when the actual intervention needs to happen in the control center. The second system to fail is thermal regulation, the stress response. Dopamine and cortisol exist in a precise balance inside the engine. When dopamine is healthy, the control center has the capacity to modulate the stress response. It can calculate, this situation is manageable. Keep moving forward. When dopamine is chronically depleted, that modulation disappears. The engine runs hot. Cortisol spikes more easily and stays elevated longer. Recovery from stress takes days instead of hours. Problems that would have been manageable now feel like system failures. And the overheating is not emotional weakness. It is the thermodynamic consequence of a control center that has lost its dampening capacity. Now consider what chronic overheating does to the rest of the engine. Researchers tracking cortisol patterns in adults with blunted dopamine function found significantly elevated baseline cortisol, not during stressful events, but at rest. The engine is running hot even at idle. And sustained thermal overload degrades muscle tissue, suppresses thyroid function, disrupts sex hormone production, and accelerates cellular aging in every major system. One broken circuit produces a cascade that touches everything. The third system to show damage is the structural hardware, muscle. This connection is almost never discussed, and it may be the most consequential one for the decade ahead. Dopamine governs not just the ability to move, but the motivation to move. The signal that says this effort is worth it. The return justifies the expenditure. When that signal is blunted, exercise stops feeling rewarding. Not because the body cannot do it, because the control center stopped telling it that it should. The walk feels pointless. The weights feel heavy in a way that has nothing to do with physical capacity. The maintenance routine falls away, not from weakness, but from a system that stopped assigning value to structural upkeep. And the consequences of this are severe. After 40, muscle mass loss is one of the most dangerous and most underestimated accelerators of age-related decline. It drives metabolic deterioration, increases cardiovascular vulnerability, accelerates cognitive decline, and erodes physical autonomy faster than almost any other single variable. Part of that acceleration, a part that almost no one connects to reward circuit function, is the dopamine system withdrawing the internal drive that makes structural maintenance feel worthwhile. Now add the sleep dimension to this picture. A blunted dopamine system makes sleep architecture worse. The transition into deep, restorative, slow-wave sleep becomes harder. The glymphatic clearance we discussed in the last block runs incompletely. Metabolic waste accumulates in the neural tissue overnight. The next day, the dopamine signal is slightly weaker. The receptor sensitivity is slightly lower, which makes sleep the following night harder to achieve, which makes the clearance even less complete. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented feedback loop, and it tightens with every cycle it runs unchecked. The downstream damage is real. It is measurable across multiple systems simultaneously, and it is cumulative in a way that makes every year of delayed recalibration more expensive to recover from. But the critical word here is cumulative, not permanent. The system is not destroyed, it is miscalibrated, and there is a fundamental difference between those two states. One is a diagnosis, the other is a repair protocol. In the next part, we go into the actual recalibration. What the research shows about restoring sensitivity to a system that has been running on the wrong inputs for years, and why the approach most people try first makes everything measurably worse. Block 5, the recalibration. What a real dopamine reset actually requires. Let's be precise about something before we go further, because the word reset has been badly used by the wellness industry, and I want to separate what we are talking about from that noise. A dopamine reset is not a week-long digital detox followed by a green smoothie. It is not a cold plunge. It is not a supplement protocol that someone is selling with a discount code. A real recalibration is a systems-level intervention. It works across multiple inputs simultaneously. It takes longer than most people want to hear, and it works in a way that nothing quick ever will, because it addresses the mechanism, not the symptoms. Here is what that actually looks like. The first principle is contrast restoration. Your reward circuit lost sensitivity because it was chronically flooded with high-stimulation, low-effort inputs. The only way to restore sensitivity is to reduce stimulation, deliberately, systematically, so that the contrast between baseline and reward becomes meaningful again. Think of it this way. If you have been in a room with the volume at maximum for years, you do not fix your hearing by playing louder sounds. You lower the volume. You let the auditory system recalibrate to a quieter baseline. Then, slowly, sounds that were previously invisible begin to register again. The brain's reward circuit works exactly the same way. In practice, contrast restoration means identifying your highest stimulation, lowest value inputs and reducing them with intention. Not eliminating pleasure, restoring the capacity to feel it. These are different operations. One is deprivation, the other is precision. The second principle is effort-reward recoupling. This is one of the most consistent and significant findings in dopamine research of the last decade. The reward circuit responds most powerfully not to the outcome of an action, but to the effortful anticipation that precedes it. Dopamine fires most strongly when a reward is earned, when the brain has calculated that real cost was paid for real return. This is why a meal you prepared yourself tastes different from a delivered one. Why a walk in an unfamiliar place feels different from a treadmill. Why finishing a difficult project produces more lasting satisfaction than a passive entertainment binge. The effort is not a price you pay. The effort is the signal. It is what tells the control center that this reward is real enough to update the system's value model. After years of effort-free stimulation, the circuit has lost its ability to recognize effort-based rewards as valuable. Recoupling requires rebuilding that recognition deliberately through small, consistent, effortful actions done without the distraction of simultaneous stimulation. Research on behavioral dopamine restoration shows measurable changes in reward pathway activity within 4 to 6 weeks of consistent effort-based behavior in adults over 40 and over 50. The receptor sites are not gone, they are downregulated, and they respond to the right signal. The third principle is substrate supply. Dopamine is synthesized in the brain from tyrosine, an amino acid derived from dietary protein. Without adequate protein intake, the control center is attempting to run a critical manufacturing process with insufficient raw material. This is a fuel supply problem. The production line is thin. In adults over 40, protein intake is chronically insufficient, particularly in women, and particularly when aging suppresses appetite signals. Distributing adequate protein consistently across the day, not concentrated in a single meal, gives the dopamine synthesis pathway the substrate it needs to function. The cofactors matter too. Iron, folate, B6, magnesium. These are not supplements to chase randomly. They are components the engine requires to convert the raw material into the finished chemical signal. When they are deficient, the production process stalls, regardless of how much tyrosine is available. The fourth principle is overnight repair completion. We have discussed glymphatic clearance and receptor restoration during sleep, but I want to be precise about what this means as an intervention. Sleep is not a passive state. It is the single most powerful recalibration window the dopamine system has access to. During adequate deep slow-wave sleep, the brain actively restores dopamine receptor density, partially reversing the downregulation caused by chronic overstimulation. This process cannot be supplemented. It cannot be hacked with devices. It requires darkness, thermal regulation, consistent timing, and critically, the absence of the alcohol and high-stimulation inputs that suppress slow-wave sleep architecture. Prioritizing sleep quality after 40 is not a wellness recommendation. It is a direct pharmacological intervention on the dopamine system, one that compounds positively with every night it is executed properly. The fifth principle is physiological stress loading. Controlled physical stress, resistance training, high-intensity cardiovascular intervals, sustained aerobic effort produces a dopamine response that is categorically different from digital or chemical stimulation. It is slower. It builds across sessions. It does not cause receptor downregulation. Exercise is one of the only known inputs that improves dopamine receptor sensitivity rather than degrading it. Studies tracking reward circuit function in physically active adults over 40 show measurably better dopamine architecture compared to sedentary controls, and the gap widens with every decade. But here is what most people miss about this mechanism. The exercise does not need to be extreme. It needs to be effortful. The key variable is not duration or intensity per se. It is the experience of genuine physical effort that the brain can recognize as a cost paid for a real return. That is what fires the reconstruction signal in the reward circuit. 20 minutes of genuine effort done consistently runs a different process than an hour of distracted, moderate movement. Now, and this is the part that makes everything above work, these 5 principles are not a sequential checklist. They are a system. They interact. The sleep improves receptor density, which makes effort-based behavior more rewarding, which makes contrast restoration easier to sustain, which makes sleep architecture more accessible the following night. The recalibration is not one lever. It is the simultaneous adjustment of the entire operating environment, which means the speed and depth of recovery depends not on how hard you attack any single variable, but on how coherently you shift the system as a whole. In the next part, we step back and look at the engine complete. Because when you can see all of these systems running together, the control center, the fuel system, the structural hardware, the firmware, the overnight repair cycle, the picture of what happened to your body after 40 becomes something you cannot unsee. Block 6, the full system. Why everything changed after 40 and what the engine looks like when it runs clean. Let's step back, not away from the detail, into the full picture. Because the most important thing I can give you in this block is not another mechanism. It is the view from above, the entire engine running together, so you can see exactly where yours has been losing signal and what it looks like when it is not. Here is the system picture. Your dopamine architecture is not a mood system. It is the central value assignment infrastructure of the human engine. It determines what feels worth pursuing, what feels worth protecting, what feels worth the investment of time, energy, and discomfort. When it runs clean, everything downstream runs better. The fuel system responds to accurate hunger and satiety signals. Insulin regulation is precise. The body burns what it should burn and stores what it actually needs. Cravings for fast energy inputs are proportionate and manageable, not compulsive, not consuming. The stress system stays calibrated. Cortisol rises when the situation requires it and returns to baseline efficiently. The engine runs at appropriate temperature. Recovery is real. Sleep is deep enough to complete the maintenance cycle. The structural hardware gets maintained. Movement feels worth doing. Effort generates satisfaction. The motivation to protect the hardware does not require external forcing. It comes from a control center that is accurately signaling the value of the investment. And the hormonal firmware, estrogen, testosterone, the entire cascade has a functioning circuit to regulate. The software has hardware worth running on. This is the engine running clean. Not perfect, not like it did at 25, but calibrated, precise, generating real signal from real inputs. Now, compare that to the picture of the degraded system. The fuel system is dysregulated. Cravings are loud. Visceral fat is accumulating because insulin signaling is imprecise, and the reward circuit is pushing toward fast energy inputs. The weight around the middle is not a discipline failure. It is the metabolic consequence of a miscalibrated control center. The stress system is running hot at idle. Cortisol is elevated when it should not be. Recovery from ordinary stress takes days. The engine is consuming itself. The structural components are losing mass because the motivation to maintain them has been withdrawn by a circuit that stopped assigning value to effort-based activity. Sleep is fragmented. The overnight repair cycle is incomplete. The debris builds. The signal degrades further each morning. And the person living inside this engine interprets all of this as aging, as the inevitable, as the person they are becoming. But aging is not the mechanism. Maintenance failure is the mechanism. And the distinction between those two things is everything. Here is what the research shows across multiple longitudinal studies of adults in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. The biological markers that most people associate with getting old, metabolic dysfunction, cognitive decline, loss of muscle mass, cardiovascular deterioration, are significantly predicted not by chronological age, but by the accumulated operating conditions of the engine across the preceding decade. How you lived in your 40s shows up in your body at 60. Not metaphorically, measurably, in tissue, in blood markers, in brain volume, in the strength of the signal your control center can still generate. This is the real stakes of the dopamine conversation. It is not about feeling more motivated this week. It is about whether your control center will still be running good signal when you are 65, whether your brain will still want to protect your own health, still find real life genuinely rewarding, still assign adequate value to the maintenance that determines your autonomy and your cognitive clarity in the years ahead. Cognitive decline, cardiovascular risk, metabolic disease, loss of physical independence. These are not inevitable. They are, in significant part, the downstream consequences of a reward circuit that was left to degrade without intervention. The dopamine system is the gateway. Because an engine whose control center has stopped signaling that maintenance is worth it will not be maintained. But you are still here, still reading the diagnostics, still running the check. That matters more than you might think. Let's talk about where you are right now. You came into this video probably thinking this was about motivation, maybe about breaking a habit, maybe about understanding why you feel flat in a way you cannot explain to anyone around you. What you actually walked through was a systems diagnosis. You now understand that the flatness is not you getting older. You understand why the weight around your middle is connected to a circuit in your brain, not a failure of discipline at the dinner table. You understand why the sleep is broken, why the stress hits harder than it should, why the things that used to make the engine run, the goals, the projects, the physical effort, stopped generating the signal they once did. You can see the engine now, not just the warning lights. And seeing the engine clearly is where real maintenance begins. This is exactly what the human engine is built for. Not a fitness channel, not a diet channel, not a place where someone sells you a 30-day transformation with a before and after photo. This is a place where men and women over 40 come to understand the actual mechanics of the machine they are living inside. The control center, the fuel system, the hormonal firmware, the structural hardware, the overnight repair cycle, and learn to maintain it with the precision it deserves at this stage of life. If that is the kind of knowledge you want to keep building, subscribe now and stay close. There is a lot more coming. Deep dives into the cortisol-dopamine axis, the one hormonal marker that most directly governs reward circuit function after 40, and that most people have never had tested. Protocols on sleep architecture restoration, a full breakdown of what the metabolic panel actually tells you about your engine's condition, and which numbers your doctor is probably not watching closely enough. This is where the serious work gets done. And the community building around this channel, the men and women who are done accepting decline as inevitable, that is where the real conversation lives. Stay close. Now, let's bring everything together, because there is one final thing I want to leave with you. Something that goes beyond the mechanisms, beyond the protocols, beyond everything we covered today. Something about what it means to live inside an engine that is actually being maintained, and what that makes possible for the decade ahead of you. Block 8. fechamento magistral. You came into this video carrying something. Not just the fatigue, not just the weight that will not move or the brain that cannot hold its focus the way it used to. You came in carrying a story. The story that your body was failing you, that the machine was winding down, that this flatness, this resistance, this quiet distance from everything that used to feel worth doing was just what getting older feels like. That story is not true. What was actually happening, what you can see clearly now, is that your control center lost signal. The reward circuit that governs what feels worth pursuing, worth protecting, worth the cost of effort, that circuit was running on the wrong operating conditions for too long. Overstimulated, undernourished, incompletely repaired. Running outdated hormonal firmware with no maintenance update in years, the engine was not failing. The engine was not being maintained. And there is a difference between those two things that changes everything about what is possible from here. You were not given a broken engine. You were given a high-precision machine that was designed for a world of scarcity, effort, and real contrast, and then placed, without instruction, inside a world of infinite stimulation, frictionless comfort, and chronic sensory noise. The engine adapted. It compensated. It did what any sophisticated system does under unsustainable operating conditions. It recalibrated downward to survive. But surviving is not running well. And running well after 40 requires something different than it did at 30. Not more force, not more discipline, not more willpower extracted from a depleted circuit. More precision, more system awareness. More willingness to look at the mechanics honestly and run the maintenance that the machine actually needs. The recalibration is real. The biology is clear. The pathway exists. What changes now is not what you know. It is what you do with a system you can finally see. Think about the person you want to be at 60. Not the aesthetic version, the functional one. Still sharp, still strong, still genuinely curious, still capable of making decisions from a place of clarity rather than exhaustion, still present in your own life in a way that feels chosen, not survived. That version of you is not built in a moment of inspiration. It is built in the maintenance decisions made quietly, consistently, on the ordinary days when no one is watching and the easier option is always available. This video was one of those decisions. Now, here is what I want you to do. Send this to at least 5 people you know who are over 40 and still reading their symptoms as character flaws. People who are blaming themselves for a systems problem they never had the language to diagnose. They need this map. Subscribe to The Human Engine if you are not already here. The next deep dive is on the one diagnostic marker that best predicts dopamine circuit health after 40, and it is not on any standard panel most people are getting from their doctor. You do not want to miss it. And leave a comment below. Tell me what landed. Tell me what shifted in the way you see your own body. Or tell me what you want this channel to go deeper on. The cortisol system, cardiovascular risk, sleep architecture, hormonal firmware, metabolic reset. This engine has many systems. We are going to cover every one of them. Until next time, keep optimizing.